Hello, my name is Rebecca D. Winter-Schmidt, and I'm the Associate Program Director at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. This brief video log provides an overview of the human rights due diligence process. It was created as part of the larger Corporate Responsibility to Respect Human Rights webinar series. The purpose of that series is to systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as framed in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in order to educate and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. There are 5 parts to the webinar series. The series unpacks the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as laid out in Guiding Principle 15. Businesses should have in place policies and processes, including a policy commitment to respect human rights. That was the subject matter of our first webinar, recorded on January 19th and available on our YouTube channel, in addition to 4 video logs introducing the webinar series and examining why investors must respect human rights, the relationship between human rights, ESG, and sustainable development goals, as well as indicators of effective leadership and governance. Again, they're all available on our YouTube channel. The next 3 webinars, beginning with our webinar plan for May 12th, look a little more deeply at the human rights due diligence process, which allows companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impacts on human rights. We'll spend a little time today talking about the steps in that due diligence process. And then the final webinar will focus on processes to remediate adverse human rights impacts which businesses cause or to which they contribute. As you see here, the human rights due diligence process is outlined in this diagram. In a nutshell, it is a manner for companies, but also investors, to know and show that their activities do no harm. This entails not only identifying, but preventing or mitigating actual and potential risks, remediating any harms that have occurred, and communicating how that is being done. The human rights due diligence process entails 4 steps, here shown as number 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the diagram. I'll go through each one in turn. But let me just note that human rights due diligence must address adverse human rights impacts that the company or investor may cause or contribute to through its own activities, or which the company or investor may be directly linked through its operations, products, or services via its business relationships. Human rights due diligence will vary in complexity depending on the size of the company, the severity of the human rights impacts, as well as the nature and context of its operations. And finally, it should be an ongoing process as human rights risks can change over time. With regards to the 4 steps of human rights due diligence, which are detailed in Guiding Principles 17 to 21, the first step is assessing actual and potential human rights impacts and involves conducting human rights impact assessment, whether as a standalone exercise or integrated into other risk assessment and management processes, such as environmental and social impact assessment or enterprise risk management. Importantly, risks to people and not risks to the company should be the focus of an impact assessment. The needed human rights expertise should be used to conduct the assessment, and throughout the assessment, stakeholders should be engaged in a meaningful manner, in particular affected rights holders. Again, our webinar on May 12th will explore context and sector-specific human rights impact assessment in more depth. The second step, integrating and acting upon findings, entails 2 things. First, assigning and resourcing responsibility to address impacts and ensuring there's adequate oversight of those efforts internally. And then second, taking action to address impacts depending upon the type of connection to the impact. Again, whether there is causation, contribution, or direct linkage via business relationships, as well as considering the leverage that a company or investor has to address that impact. In some situations, it may be necessary for a company or investor to seek to increase its leverage to prevent or mitigate a human rights impact. The third step, tracking responses to impacts, involves verifying that impacts are effectively being addressed and human rights policies implemented accordingly by utilizing appropriate quantitative and qualitative indicators and drawing on feedback, again, including from affected stakeholders. And then finally, companies, as well as investors, must communicate externally how impacts are addressed. Communications can take different forms and frequencies, but must be undertaken in a way that is accessible to affected stakeholders and allows for an evaluation of the adequacy of a company's response to negative human rights impacts. Finally, I just wanted to share with all of you this diagram. This is taken from our investor toolkit for human rights. And it outlines how investors are to undertake human rights due diligence, both at the institutional level, at the level of the organization as an institutional investor, and at the investment level. At the investment level, the role and responsibility of institutional investors is to assess whether their portfolio companies have robust and effective human rights policies, due diligence processes, and grievance mechanisms in place, and to take meaningful action to address any harms. Investors should embed this approach across the whole of the investment lifecycle, including in their activities prior to investment decision-making, in their investment decision-making, and throughout investment stewardship activities to potentially also include considering divestment and what responsible divestment should look like. Again, please look at our investor toolkit on human rights available on our website to learn more about what the human rights due diligence process looks like for investors at these two levels. Thank you for listening to our video log, and we hope you will join us on May 12th for our Human Rights Impact Assessment webinar, and then for the future remaining 3 webinars of this series. Thank you. Goodbye.